Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses, and this is Desaguliers John Theophilus from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. Desaguliers John Theophilus. Of those who were engaged in the revival of Freemasonry in the beginning of the 18th century, none performed a more important part than he to whom may be well applied the epithet of the father of modern speculative masonry, and to whom, perhaps more than any other person in the present Grand Lodge of England, indebted for its existence. A sketch of his life, drawn from the scanty materials to be found in Masonic records, and in the brief notices of a few of his contemporaries, cannot fail to be interesting to the study of Masonic history. The Reverend John Theophilus Desaguliers, LLD FRS, was born on the 12th of March, 1683, at Rochelle in France. He was the son of a French Protestant clergyman, and his father having removed to England as a refugee. On the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, he was educated at Christ Church, Oxford, where he took lessons of the celebrated Kell in experimental philosophy. In 1712, he received the degree of Master of Arts, and in the same year succeeded Dr. Kell as a lecturer on experimental philosophy at Hart Hall, now Hertford College. In the year 1713, he removed to Westminster, where he continued his course of lectures, being the first one, it is said, who ever lectured upon physical science in the metropolis. At this time he attracted the notice and secured the friendship of Sir Isaac Newton. His reputation as a philosopher obtained for him a fellowship in the Royal Society. He was also about this time admitted to clerical orders and appointed by the Duke of Chandos, his chaplain, who also presented him to the living of Whitchurch. In 1718, he received from the University of Oxford the degree of Doctor of Civil Law, and was presented by the Earl of Sunderland to a living in Norfolk, which he afterward exchanged for one in Essex. He maintained, however, his residence in London, where he continued to deliver his lectures until his death in 1744. His contributions to science consist of a treatise on the construction of chimneys, translated from the French and published in 1716, Lectures of Experimental Philosophy, of which a second edition was issued in 1719, a course of experimental philosophy in 2 volumes, published in 1734 and in 1735. He edited an edition of Gregory's Elements of Cataptrics and Dioptries. He also translated from Latin Grandisande's Mathematical Elements of Natural Philosophy. In the clerical profession, he seems not to have been an ardent worker, and his theological labors were confined to the publication of a single sermon on repentance. He was, in fact, more distinguished as a scientist than as a clergyman, and Priestley calls him an indefatigable experimental philosopher. It is, however, as a Mason that Dr. Desaguliers will most attract our attention. Soon after his arrival in London, he was made a Mason in the lodge meeting at Goose and Gridiron in St. Paul's Churchyard, which subsequently took the name of the Lodge of Antiquity. The peculiar principles of the craft, says Dr. Oliver, struck him as being eminently calculated to contribute to the benefit of the community at large, if they could be redirected into the channel from which they had been diverted by the retirement of Sir Christopher Wren. It is said that he visited the veteran architect, and from his conversations with him was induced to inaugurate those measures which led in 1717 to the revival of Freemasonry in the south of England. The reputation of Desaguliers as a man of science enabled him to secure the necessary assistance of older Masons to carry the design of revival into effect, and supported by the activity and zeal of many brethren, he succeeded in obtaining a meeting of the 4 London lodges in 1717 at the Apple Tree Tavern, where the Grand Lodge was constituted in due form, and at a subsequent meeting on St. John the Baptist's Day, Anthony Sayer was elected Grand Master. but nothing is known as to his connection with Freemasonry until 1719, when he was elevated to the throne of the Grand Lodge, succeeding George Payne, and being thus the third Grand Master after the revival. He paid much attention to the interest of the fraternity, and so elevated the character of the order that the records of the Grand Lodge show that during his administration, several of the older brethren who had hitherto neglected the craft resumed their visits to the lodges, and many noblemen were initiated into the lodge. Dr. Desaguliers was peculiarly zealous in the investigation and collection of the old records of the society, and to him we are principally indebted for the preservation of the charges of a Freemason and the preparation of the general regulations, which are found in the first edition of the Constitutions, which, although attributed to Dr. Anderson, was undoubtedly compiled under the supervision of Desaguliers. Anderson, we suppose, did the work, while Desaguliers furnished much of the material and the thought. One of the first controversial works in favor of Freemasonry, namely, A Detection of Dr. Plot's Account of the Freemasons, was also attributed to his pen, but he is said to have repudiated the credit of its authorship, of which indeed the paper furnishes no internal evidence. In 1721 he delivered before the Grand Lodge what the records call an eloquent oration about Masons and Masonry. It does not appear that it was ever published, at least no copy of it is in extant, although Ploss puts the title at the head of his catalogue of Masonic orations. It is indeed the first Masonic address of which we have any notice, and would be highly interesting, because it would give us, in all probability, as Ploss remarks, the views of the Masons of that day in reference to the design of the institution. After his retirement from the office of Grand Master in 1720, Desaguliers was 3 times appointed Deputy Grand Master in 1723 by the Duke of Wharton, in June of the same year by the Earl of Dalkeith, in 1725 by Lord Paisley, and during this period of service he did many things for the benefit of the craft, among others, initiating that scheme of charity, which was subsequently developed in what is now known in the Grand Lodge of England as the Fund of Beneficence. After this, Dr. Desaguliers passed over to the continent and resided for a few years in Holland. In 1731 he was at the head and presided as worshipful master of a lodge organized under a special dispensation for the purpose of initiating and passing the Duke of Lorraine, who was subsequently Grand Duke of Tuscany, and the Emperor of Germany. The Duke was, during the same year, made a Master Mason in England. On his return to England, Desaguliers was considered, for his position in Masonry, as the most fitting person to confer the degrees on the Prince of Wales, who was accordingly entered, passed, and raised in an occasional lodge, held on 2 occasions at Kew, over which Dr. Desaguliers presided as master. Dr. Desaguliers was very attentive to his Masonic duties, and punctual in his attendance on the communications of the Grand Lodge. His last recorded appearance by name is on the 8th of February, 1742, but a few years after his death. Of Desaguliers' Masonic and personal character, Dr. Oliver gives, from tradition, the following description. There were many traits in his character that redound to his immortal praise. He was a grave man in private life, almost approaching to austerity, but he could relax in the private recesses of a tiled lodge, and in company with his brothers and fellows, where the ties of social intercourse are not particularly stringent. He considered the proceedings of the lodge as strictly confidential, and being persuaded that his brothers by initiation actually occupied the same position as brothers by blood, he was undisguisedly free and familiar in the mutual interchange of unrestrained courtesy. In the lodge he was jocose and free-hearted, sang a song, and had no objection to share of the bottle, although one of the most learned and distinguished men of his day. In 1713, Desaguliers had married a daughter of William Pudsey, Esquire, by whom he had 2 sons, Alexander, who was a clergyman, and Thomas, who went into the army and became a colonel of artillery, and an equerry to George III. In the latter days of Dr. Desaguliers are said to have been clouded with sorrow and poverty. Dr. Feller, in the following work, says that he became insane, dressing sometimes as a harlequin and sometimes as a clown, and that in one of those fits of insanity he died. And Cawthorne, in a poem entitled The Vanity of Human Enjoyments, intimates in the following lines that Desaguliers was in very necessitous circumstances at the time of his death. How poor, neglected Desaguliers fell, how he who taught too gracious kings to view, all buoyed, ennobled, and all Bacon knew, died in a cell without a friend to save, without a guinea and without a grave. But the accounts of the French biographer and the English poet are most probably both apocryphal, or at least much exaggerated. For Nichols, who knew him personally and gave a fine portrait of him in the 9th volume of his Literary Anecdotes, says that he died on the 29th of February 1744 at the Bedford Coffee House and was buried in the Savoy. Too few Masons of the present day, except to those who have made Freemasonry a subject of a special study, is the name of Desaguliers very familiar, but it is well they should know that to him, perhaps more than to any other man, are we indebted for the present existence of Freemasonry as a living institution. For when in the beginning of the 18th century, Masonry had fallen into a state of decay which threatened its existence, it was Desaguliers who, by his energy and enthusiasm, infused a spirit of zeal into his contemporaries, which culminated in the revival of the year 1717. For it was his learning and social position that gave a standing to the institution which brought to its support noble men and men of influence, so that the insignificant assemblage of 4 London lodges at the Apple Tree Tavern was expanded into an association which now overshadows the entire civilized world. And the moving spirit of all this was John Theophilus Desaguliers. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.